Managing text flow by using CSS. Manage the flow of a text content by using CSS. This is the agenda. First off, we're looking at CSS regions, then columns and hyphenation, and finally at CSS exclusions. CSS regions. With HTML, you can organize content into separate sections, but what can you do if you want content to flow from one region into another? CSS regions are sections of a document where content can flow from one region into another. If there's too much content in one section, then the remaining content automatically flows into another region. Regions can be placed anywhere on a screen, as evidenced in the graphic on the left-hand side. Implementing CSS regions. When creating a CSS region, you must specify a content source and content containers. You set up CSS regions with the flow into and flow from properties. A content source is a chunk of text that holds the content you want to flow through the regions. Content containers are the areas where you want your content to appear. You should use a separate HTML document as the source. Should note that this was intended to work in conjunction with a grid layout. You are unlikely to come across CSS regions, although this could come up in the exam, so it is important to know how it's supposed to work. The flow from and flow into properties. Using an ID as a selector, identify the content source using the main value of the flow into property. See the top right of the example there. This content will require content containers to appear on a web page. With a specific class as a selector, region in the example, use the same value used with the flow into property for the value of the flow from property to place content into a container. This is how the source and content containers are associated. So if you look at the content and the region on the right hand side there in the example, you will see that MS flow into and MS flow from are both defined as main. In this example, we can see this in further detail. So flow into main identifies the content source. Flow from main in the region class identifies the content containers. Notice that the values of the flow from and flow into properties must match. Notice also that the content source is not displayed within the source div, but is flowed into the regions. Overflowing text in regions. The height of a region won't automatically adjust to fit all content, so you must define the height of regions. If there's content available after all regions have been filled, then the last region will either be cut off, visibly overflow, or overflow and be hidden. You can see an example of visible overflow on the right hand side. The overflow and region fragment properties can be used to control how overflow content is treated. You can set region fragment to auto or break. You can set overflow to visible or hidden. The Microsoft implementation of CSS regions. Instead of using div tags to implement CSS regions, Microsoft uses the iframe element. An iframe is used with unique IDs as well as the MS vendor prefix with the flow from and flow into properties. So the important thing here really is just to remember the Microsoft implementation of CSS regions uses iframe instead of div. There is an example of CSS regions in the PDF, Course book, you won't be able to get that to work because CSS regions is not currently being implemented in the vast majority of browsers. There is an example which I will show you on one of the following slides. So this is the slide which gives you basically just a link to a demo of CSS regions actually being implemented. There's only one specific browser that it was implemented on in a very specific case, but it is quite interesting to read it, and it helps you to get an understanding of how it's supposed to work. It was by a lady called Rachel Andrew. She also wrote an article which sort of sits alongside the video basically, which you can access from the link on the page there. Let's have a look at columns and hyphenation. Creating columns. Well, CSS allows you to create columns and divide content among the columns. This is called the multi-column layout. There are three primary CSS properties that you can use to manipulate columns. These are column count, column gap, and column rule. Okay, so those are all sort of valid CSS, and you can access the link at the bottom of the page there, again on W3 Schools, to give you some real kind of useful examples on how to use these. Okay, you've got an example obviously on the right hand side of a multi-column layout. Some of the column properties I'll just sort of skip through. You can pause the video if you want to read them in a bit more detail. To get the most up-to-date information, I would look at W3 Schools. Using hyphenation. If you want text to cover the entirety of a column, then you can enable hyphenation. Hyphenation is the process of connecting two parts of the same word with a hyphen. To implement hyphenation, use the hyphens property along with one of the three values. Auto, which enables hyphenation, manual enables hyphenation as well, and none prevents hyphenation. A note as well, in order to work, it requires that the developer insert shy hyphens in the text to be displayed. The symbols for that are ampersand SHY. I will share a link on the next slide which gives you some more information on how this should work. These are the links that are worth having a look at. This isn't explained that well in the PDF book, so it is worth looking into researching a bit on W3 Schools. So have a look at that link there. There's also a good explanation on YouTube from somebody who's actually showing how this is put into practice, so that's worth having a look at too. In order for hyphenation to work properly, you must declare a language. So to do so, use the HTML tag with the lang attribute. The value should be set according to the language being used. For example, HTML lang equals EN. So that's the language code for English. Vendor prefixes must also be applied with the hyphens property in CSS for them to work properly. If you want to have a look at a columns demo, there's an example in the book, but again I would recommend looking at W3 Schools, as it probably does the best job of showing how columns work in the most up-to-date, with the most up-to-date data on how it should work. Next up, we're going to be looking at CSS exclusions. A CSS exclusion is also referred to as a positioned float, and that allows you to place elements in a specific location on a web page. After you position the float, other content will wrap around it. CSS exclusions allow you to specify positioning from the top, bottom, left and right of a container. Exclusions can also be created in a variety of shapes. So how would you create a CSS exclusion? You declare an exclusion by using the wrap flow property with the preferred value. You then modify the shape of an exclusion using the shape outside and shape inside properties. Note that CSS exclusions may not be supported by all of the major browsers, and you should use vendor prefixes and experiment with as many browsers as possible to make sure that the content renders properly. Some of the properties for CSS exclusions are shown on this page. I'll let you pause the video to look at them in more detail if you wish to do so. You can find some more information about CSS exclusions at that link there on the Microsoft website. In summary, we've talked about CSS regions, columns and hyphenation, and CSS exclusions.